Are we live? Yes, we are live. Okay, great. So welcome back to the People's Academy for the final unit of the first chapter of the curriculum, which is focused on the theme of internationalism and national liberation. In the first three units, we traced the story of the global struggle against imperialism. We considered how colonialism fueled the capitalist economies. We looked at the significance of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance forces in that broader struggle against colonialism. And we looked at Marxism as an analytical tool that both shaped and was shaped by those resistance movements. In the previous unit, we also looked at the Cold War, not simply as a contest between the capitalist West and the socialist East, but as part of a broader systemic struggle of imperialism against the world's working people. That struggle, as we saw, has not ended. Indeed, it faced a setback with the fall of the USSR, and it has entered a dangerous and hopeful new phase today. Palestine, of course, is a central site of that global struggle. It's the Palestinian resistance and, of course, the genocidal war that has been waged against the Palestinian people have exposed nearly all of the contradictions in the international system, and they set in motion processes that are transforming that system. And today we're going to look at some of the key questions relating to that struggle in Palestine. The nature of that long struggle for national liberation, the role of self-defense in questions of social reproduction and accumulation, Zionism as an instrument of US imperialism, and the relationship of the regional resistance with the broader solidarity movement that has emerged in the region and also across the world. And here to discuss these questions with us are Miriam Abu Samra and Max Eil. Miriam is a Marie Curie postdoc fellow at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage at the University of Venice and at the Department of Anthropology at UC Davis, USA. She has been active in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement and is a founding member of the transnational Palestinian Youth Movement. And Max is the author of A People's Green New Deal. He is associate editor of the Agrarian South Journal. He sits on the editorial board of Middle East Critique and is a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, while being a longstanding anti-Zionist activist. So Max, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and I will now launch into a discussion about the role of as soon as I figure it out. Okay, as soon as I open up slideshow. Where is it? Okay, so what I'm going to briefly discuss before Miriam discusses the history of transnational Palestinian resistance to Zionism and imperialism is I'm going to briefly set the stage with a discussion of Palestine's role in US imperialism historically, and then I will return to it after her presentation in the present day. This is something much debated in contemporary movements because there tends to be an assumption that somehow the US support for the Zionism is non-functional for the process of accumulation on a world scale. So in fact, there's first we should just have a very brief clarification of concepts, and that often it's thought that capitalism is a process where you're bartering, trading, you're trying to secure advantage through trade with an antagonistic party and so forth. Actually, it is a system of accumulation of value on a world scale, and distinct regions and distinct mechanisms, distinct processes play different roles within that system of accumulation on a world scale. And this is very important to keep in mind, that there are some things, some processes will not involve simply trading for profit or direct labor exploitation. They'll also be about setting the conditions for labor exploitation on a world scale. That is the political question, the question of politics, the question of securing the ideological basis that allows people to be exploited or lets them submit or surrender to their exploitation or their dispossession. So it cannot be straightforwardly reduced to going into a supermarket and someone haggling with the merchant over the price of a piece of bread. In fact, there's a whole set of other conditions that both constitute but also antedate the process through which you enter into this kind of haggling capitalistic exploitation. Of course, the history is very long, but classically, from the moment of the founding of Israel itself, it was understood by the ideologues who founded it, for example, Theodor Herzl, that Zionism would constitute a rampart or a forward post of so-called civilization against the continents of Africa and Asia. Right? It was understood that this would then, and you find this in, for example, Theodor Jabotinsky, that this would put the Zionist state in a fundamental contradiction with the people living on that land. And so the entire history of Zionism can, in fact, be productively read not only as a process of the destruction of the Palestinian people, but furthermore as a search for an alliance with a European patron who could provide this potentially isolated Zionist state with financial support, with military support, with political support. And in turn, this meant that the Zionist state would have to carry out activities that were functional, that were useful, that were profitable even for US imperialism. Right. And this is also why that it's important to distinguish here between colonialism, that is a mechanism for value transfer between poorer and richer nations. For example, the process of value transfer and drain from India or South Asia to Britain, and settler colonialism. That is when people of European origin in a capitalist system go in and colonize another people's land. This immediately transports this kind of contradiction between North and South into the process of nation-state construction itself, right? Because the process of nation-state construction is going to hit up against the friction of a people who refuse to be colonized and subjugated. Right. So this brings us to the Cold War, 1945. It's often thought that the Cold War was a process of anti-communism. In fact, it's more productive to think of the Cold War as a process of preventing delinked accumulation, or the constitution of autonomous poles of capital accumulation. That is, the constitution of countries that had autonomous industrial and technological capacity that was separate from the aegis and the system of the US, from whose circuits the US and Europe would not be able to profit from. So therefore, this is why the US encouraged subordinate industrialization in Japan and Europe, and of course rejected Soviet catch-up industrialization, right? And so this also allows us to have a slightly different perspective on the role of the founding of the Zionist entity. Right. Then very briefly, we can go to the 1948 or 1947, 1949 period. This was the period of the crystallization of the new settler property relations. That is when capitalist, colonial, settler colonial developments suddenly hardened in historical Palestine, setting up a new and very militarized state, right? And what it did was it also immediately destabilized the colonial or semi-colonial regimes that were in place across the Arab region, and kind of destabilize them because they had been unable to defend Palestine. And you can find Nasser, for example, discussing this, or the Ba'ath, and push them in the direction of an increasingly anti-systemic form of Arab nationalism, right? And this kind of set the stage from an Arab, what was called the Arab Cold War, that is Arab monarchism and increasingly Arab oil wealth, which was increasingly central to US power, versus the rising tide of Arab nationalism. In 1967, Israel played a keystone role for the US as it slammed what were called the frontline states, especially Egypt and Syria, delegitimizing their projects for, or their ambitions or their aspirations for Arab unity, delegitimizing the idea of combining internal redistribution with confrontation with Israel, and kind of destabilizing Egypt as the historical major population center for the Arab world, as a kind of catalyst for radical politics, right? So this was a great gift to imperialism. In return for this great gift to imperialism, by 1970, the US began to see Israel as a major cog in its overall machinery of accumulation, understanding, of course, that different cogs have different roles in the machine. That is, a machine is not like a jelly or something with the same consistency everywhere. Different pieces are playing different roles in that machine. So what role did Israel come to play post 1967? One, it played a role both explicitly in itself, but also supporting other countries in defending settler property relationships. That is, defending settler accumulation at the expense of the people who are living on that land. And it also, as we will see, played this role throughout in many countries in Africa. It also was defending colonialism in a world scale, both in principle and practice. It defended the inequality of nations in the world system by asserting, through its very actions, that some countries did not have sovereignty rights in the world system. They did not have the rights to decide how they were going to develop and accumulate. They also forced regional developmental resources to be diverted to warfare. That is, 8, 9, 10% of, for example, Iraqi and Egyptian GDP went to defensive armoring against the Israeli threat. And this also created a pretext and reason for escalating the nationalist orientation of many Arab states against the push for internal social redistribution. Post-1967, therefore, you saw an extensive Israeli regional military buildup. Again, this is often assimilated to what is called Cold War logics, right? I think it's actually not very helpful. It's more helpful to say what class position was Israel assisting? What types of accumulation was Israel helping to occur on a world scale? And so from 1967, especially 1970 onwards, US military aid to Israel became astronomical. But what is US military aid? US military aid in general is actually a mechanism through which the US budget is directly sent to US military contractors, right? It's actually direct subsidy to the US military industrial plant. In the Israeli case, very uniquely, and in part because of the great faith of the US power structure in its Israeli partners, but also because there was this lubricating agent between these two power structures. This is what is often characterized as the Israel lobby. 25% of the US military aid was actually allowed to stay in Israel and to assist the buildup of a domestic military industrial complex, right? And so this actually became very fundamental for subsequent accumulation in Israel, and allowed it to become the regional power that we know it is today. It also, because of the US commitment to maintaining what is called the qualitative military edge, the US, therefore, would always be sometimes selling, but often giving the most advanced arms to Israel, while also selling great amounts of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states and Jordan. And in the process, Israel kind of became this kind of regional irritant, which meant that around it, arms sales became almost an inevitability and also necessary. And so the actual disruptive role of Israel actually became very functional and useful for the entire articulation of the Arab region with the US Pentagon complex, and created a captive market that was perpetually being created and recreated by the constant state of tension that Israel was creating in the region. And as we see, when looked at this way, the Cold War has very little to do with the Israeli role in the region. We see it much more focused around arms sales and also preventing the use of regional resources for regional popular development, right? Furthermore, Israel also did other favors for the US military-industrial complex, but also US political engineering on a wide scale. It carried out systematic military sales to settler Africa. It was extremely close to South Africa. It was extremely close to so-called Rhodesia, and stabilized, as long as it could, the settler colonial property systems within those states, actually in turn diverting a great amount of the resources of the Southern African cone to pushing militarization, rather than those countries being able to then embark on a process of national popular development, some of which, of course, Zimbabwe has now set in motion. Right. Israel also became, of course, very central in terms of offering military assistance to the Southern Cone in Latin America. It was supplying weapons to the fascist and anti-Semitic Argentinian dictatorship. It supplied the Central American sub-fascist states with weapons. Again, this is often assimilated to the US Cold War, which is then cast as a war against communism. But in fact, the militarization of the world was assisted by Israel, and the constant arms sales were assisted by the presence of Israel, but also because Israel was able to bypass congressional arms embargoes, for example, to Nicaragua, and offer these arms directly to the fascist forces in Central America and South America, and in this way assist the maintenance of capitalist property relationships on a world scale. And of course, this entire process, especially when it came to the Arab Gulf states, furthermore promoted the diversion of oil proceeds, which were a historic area of contestation for the Arab nationalist movements and Arab nationalist populist or radical Marxist ideology. It made sure that the oil proceeds would remain in both the hands of regional upper classes, but also would be diverted to U.S. weapons purchases, and also by promoting undemocratic outcomes in the Arab-Iranian region, of course, until the 1979 revolution in Iran. It furthermore ensured that the states themselves would remain outside of the control of the popular classes, right? So in these ways, and I'm going to talk a little bit after Miriam's presentation, I'm going to talk much more about the post-Soviet moment in more detail. In this way, Israel was actually a major cog in US and worldwide accumulation by ensuring that developmental resources went to war, by ensuring a constant state of tension, by ensuring that popular struggles could not occur, by justifying securitization of Arab politics, by burning up resources in the region, by promoting warfare and taking the side of reactionary forces in the region. For example, in Lebanon, in the destruction of the Popular Front in Lebanon between the Palestinians and the Lebanese left, and so forth. And so in this way, Israel actually helped maintain the architecture of regional accumulation by actually attacking any and all forces that were opposed to the U.S. dispensation in the region. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Miriam, who's going to offer an expansive survey about the role of Palestine and internationalism and popular resistance. Miriam, you're muted.
All right, yeah, I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Max, for this extensive introduction to a topic that is fundamental to understand how the Palestinian movement has operated over the years, and in 1 century of resistance struggle and liberation struggle, and how they have framed their struggle within this understanding of internationalism and anti-imperialism. So what I will do is just like introducing what was the vision and what were the strategies that the Palestinian Liberation Movement have utilized over, since, let's take, the Nakba, so 1948, just to have the same reference that we have used. But of course, this understanding of colonialism as integral to, the imperialist project was there since the emergence of the Zionist movement and the implementation of the Zionist project, the colonial project over Palestine. But let's try to understand how they have framed their vision and their strategies in the aftermath of 1948, when the movement started to reorganize, following the Nakba and the forced expulsion and ethnic cleansing that Palestinians had to face with the establishment of the state of Israel. What happened in that year? Just to give some general overview and historical background that can let us understand how the Palestinian Liberation Movement actually formed. What happened with that, with the Nakba? As most of us most probably already know, the Nakba meant the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, among several other things, among the geopolitical transformation, the political relevance of that moment, and so on. It meant the Palestinians were forcibly expelled and also, of course, killed, and then villages were destroyed and so on. But the majority of the Palestinian people, over 750,000 Palestinians, were forcibly expelled from their houses, from their villages, and they became refugees in the neighboring Arab countries, as well as in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. This meant that the people were fragmented, that the social texture of the Palestinian people was destroyed, and in the aftermath of the Nakba, being scattered throughout the Arab world, there was a need to reorganize. There was a need to overcome this fragmentation, and this fragmentation was a fragmentation that meant social fragmentation, but also political fragmentation. So there was also a need to re-establish a political connection, to re-establish a political framework that would allow Palestinians to operate and to actually voice their ambition in a context that was already characterized by collusion with colonial powers, by interests that were part of the imperial project that was being implemented within the whole Arab region, where Palestine was, of course, the most affected one, was the symbol of this colonial project and the imperialist project, and it had ramifications that went well beyond the material conditions, but that also meant the fragmentation of the Palestinian people and the fragmentation of the whole region. So Palestinians started to organize, and who had the main role in the reorganization of the society and in also the articulation of a political vision were actually students. I'm going to share very quickly. I don't want to go through a full presentation, but I want to share some images that can give us the idea of how the liberation movement emerged and how they were articulating their struggle. So I'll share my screen very quickly. Okay. Oh no, sorry, not this one. One second. Okay. So we're saying this. I just very briefly just share some images and what was the vision and the strategies that they were articulating at that time. So I was saying that the students actually played a fundamental role in the rearticulation of the Palestinian political analysis. And they were able to do so by confronting their ideas and actually developing their analysis through the confrontation and the discussion and the exchanges that they were having at that time in Arab universities, where they would meet also other students that were part of other liberation movement and the experience of liberation struggle that were typical of those years, the 50s and so on. In particular, for example, just to give you a very relevant example, actually, the exchange the Palestinian students were able to establish with Algerian students in universities, particularly in Cairo throughout the 50s, or also, for example, in Beirut, was very significant for the articulation of an analysis that actually placed Zionism as a colonial project, as a colonial ideology, at the core of the general and the overall imperialist project that the US and the West were implementing over not just the Arab region, but what was called the Third World at that time. It was very important for Palestinian students to actually interact with other students coming from different regions, to articulate this analysis that was going beyond the narrow understanding of a nationalist struggle, but they were able to actually frame their nationalist ambition, the national ambition within this articulation, within this analysis. There was a critical analysis that required a transformative effort of the overall international system, where imperialism and capitalism were fundamental in implementing the colonial oppression the Palestinians were facing. So anti-colonialism was at the core of the analysis that Palestinian youth developed, and that actually informed the emergence and the vision of those that became the most relevant parties, let's say, or faction or movements, actually, that then became the most prominent actor within the Palestinian liberation movement. In this case, I'm referring to Fatah, for example, or the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that actually, actually emerged through the effort of this youth at the American University of Beirut, in the case of the PFLP, or Fatah at the University of Cairo, and the experience of students in Cairo, again at the very beginning of the 50s, through the efforts of students in that city. So Zionism and the experience that Palestinians were living, the fragmentation, the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing were understood as part of this colonial, ideology that was still typical of the Western world, despite any claim of a new international order that was emerging in the aftermath of World War II, and that was supposed to actually guarantee equality, justice, universal right to everyone else. For Palestinians, it was clear since the very beginning that this was just an illusion, that at the same time that the international community was claiming to guarantee equality and justice, they were actually partitioning Palestine and therefore legitimizing another colonial project, unveiling the real nature of an unbalanced international system that needed to remain based on capitalist interests and imperialist oppression. Zionists therefore became the symbol and part of and product, the direct continuation of colonial history and imperialist interests within the region and beyond the region. So at the international level, it became therefore fundamental that any strategy that would be articulated could be based on this analysis, and therefore internationalism and third world solidarity, and actually I would say more than third world solidarity, it was joint struggle, would be at the basis of any effort the Palestinians made throughout the years and throughout the following decades. And this This is how they articulated their revolutionary vision. They, as I said, internationalism was part and parcel of any kind of effort that the students and Palestinians in different sectors, how they organized themselves, in those years in popular union, actually made in the whole overall activities. What do I mean by that? As I was saying, the need at that time, in the aftermath of the Nakba was that of rearticulating a political vision that was able to express this ambition, this anti-colonial vision that was in a way kind of overshadowed by the narrative that was instead, typical of diplomacy, among leaders and institutions. But they also needed to reorganize their structures and also to reclaim representation in a moment where Palestinians were not even recognized as a people. And they were considered just Arab refugees within the Arab region. So they also started reorganizing their own structure. And in 1955, it was actually the students that for the first time were able to establish the first transnational popular union that would represent their own sector, the General Union of the Palestinian Students. So by doing so, they were able to reorganize one sector and to set the example for all other sectors of Palestinian society to reorganize in order to make an impact and actually interact with other unions, international unions. For example, in this case, the International Union of Students, that was one of the most relevant spaces for interaction for third world movements as representative of the Palestinian people. And this is for example, part of what the students did. They reorganized and they were able at this point to voice the ambition of the Palestinian people within this understanding of anti-colonialism and liberation struggle that was not just referring to the national ambition of the Palestinian people, but that were based on a critical analysis of Zionism as part of an imperialist project that was being imposed on other people, that was being imposed on other regions of the world. So the narrative and the strategies were cooperation, constant cooperation and exchange with other liberation movements, and within the understanding that the struggle for liberation was part of a joint effort that would actually bring about a transformation of the whole international system. And here, we have some of the posters, for example, that were prepared and that were used by the Palestinian student movement, the Palestinian Student Union, everywhere, particularly in Europe, where they were advocating for their rights, and they were trying to push for a discourse and push for a narrative that would be able to highlight the connection between the different struggles that were happening in different areas of the third world, so that people could join and so that people could actually mobilize. And when I say people, I also refer to the different, for example, student movements, but also workers, worker unions, and so on, that were active throughout the 60s and 70s, a little bit everywhere in Europe, in a completely different context that was that of the Cold War, and therefore, a different way of also understanding cooperation with third world movements. And here we can see some of the examples where, Rhodesia, South Africa, Latin America, Vietnam here were considered as, the same, part of the struggle of the Palestinian people. Again, here the reference is to the PLO, the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine, that cooperates with ANC in South Africa, with SWAPO, and so many other movements within the south of the world. This is a poster that was actually that I chose it not just because I have Italian roots, but because I think it's important to see how already in the 70s, the Palestinian revolution, as they were presenting it in this poster, would be presented, in Western context with a very clear framework of what it meant to be part of a liberation struggle. And in this poster, it says that revolution will be achieved with armed struggle, and the solution would be the fight against, for a democratic state in Palestine, fighting against imperialism and Zionism and all the reactionary powers that characterize the international scene in the mid-70s. So that was the vision, and that was the kind of internationalism that characterized first the experience of the students that mobilized as the first sector in the 70s, but also, it became part and it was incorporated in the movement that emerged from the students' effort, as I was mentioning, just to go through the two most relevant ones, and most known one that, as I said, it was the PFLP and Fatah, and therefore ended up, of course, being endorsed and becoming, the main narrative, the main strategy of the PLO once the PLO was established, and particularly once the PLO actually developed into a real revolutionary movement in the at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. And these are just like other example of how the Palestinian struggle would relate to anti-imperialism and how they were centering other struggles, as part of their own effort for liberation. These are two examples in French, for example, where again this was a poster that was made by the Palestinian Committee in France that was actually saying that the Palestinian revolution is against imperialism and Zionism. Again, Zionism understood as the outcome of imperialism, as a product of imperialist politics and interest over the region. And again, of course, the commitment to the Vietnamese struggle for Palestinians. And here again, we can see exactly, in the same way that I was just explaining, how the PLO, for example, found in the IRA in Ireland the common struggle against imperialism, and therefore, colonialism and colonial interest being understood as at the core of a project that is much larger, and therefore, liberation within this specific effort. And why is this important? Because it was clear at that time that the liberation could only come through the joint effort of all these movements, and it could not be just an isolated struggle, because an isolated change, but not the structural change that was needed to actually prevent colonialism for remaining the structure that underlies the overall organization of the world order. And this is why, for example, this is another poster that was made by the PLO, where the different leaders in the Arab world and Third World movement were considered the leaders of the liberation struggle altogether in a transformation that was a systemic transformation that was part of the effort of the Palestinian movement. All this, just to refer very generally to how the Palestinian movement had framed their vision in the 70s and part of the 80s. These actually changed later on with the transformation in the international system, and of course with the end of the Cold War, the transformation of the 90s, and with the Oslo Accords, we saw that this language of internationalism was kind of lost. It was actually diluted within the neoliberal effort to present the Palestinian question in a much more pragmatic way that was completely decontextualized the oppression of Palestinians from the colonial project that was at the basis of it. It was therefore, there was a disconnect in understanding the causes that actually brought to the oppression, and this meant that even the language for expressing and for explaining the Palestinian cause was shifted and was replaced with a narrative that was a neoliberal narrative that would talk about state building, to state solution, and so on. This meant that the anti-colonial nature of the struggle was actually lost, and it was overshadowed by a pragmatism that was based on negotiations, and it was part of the neoliberal effort and the hegemonic neoliberal thought that has dominated the international system since the 90s. Why am I saying this? Because while this happened, and while there was a paralysis, and kind of the impossibility to actually reframe or actually bring the root causes of the Palestinian question back into the debate for the past 30 years, what we are seeing today is that actually in the past few years, and in particular after October 7, there, this language has been refound in a way, and with the effort of the Palestinian movement, with the example of the Palestinian movement, and with also in the global north, with the mobilization of Palestinian newer generation and the global movement that developed around their mobilization, around their efforts, there is a newly found or refound understanding of the anti-colonial nature of the Palestinian question, and therefore of the connection with imperialism and the connection with capitalism as the real issue that is actually allowing the genocide, that is actually allowing the colonial project to go on. What we are seeing is that there is an awareness of not just the failure of the international system, but a critical analysis of the international system as part of the problem, as part of that structure that allows and that is established to allow the perpetuation of an unbalanced power relation between the capitalist powers and oppressed people all over the world. The system, the international system, is organized to make sure that this kind of exploitation, this kind of oppression and colonialism as part and expression of that kind of oppression are reproduced through the international system. And this is what is emerging now. And this is how now the global movement is understanding the Palestinian question. And this is why the mobilization is not framed just as solidarity for the Palestinians, but necessity to actually fight the system that allows that oppression to be implemented, that colonial violence, that colonial extermination to be implemented. And in this sense, what we are seeing is that even the form of repressions that are emerging and that are characterizing the whole system, in a way show that there is an awareness that this kind of analysis is developing among newer generation, and that what is being criticized is not just the violence and the genocide on Palestine, but the system as it is, as the structural problem, as the systemic problem that needs to be changed and that needs to be readdressed. And the connection that is being made there is what is, new in this historical moment, and what is actually at the basis of the newer generation effort in framing their role and in framing the analysis of what's happening right now. I think I will stop here so that Max can actually develop this further, looking at the real transformations that are happening on the ground right now. Max.
Great. So I think you have to unshare, Miriam, so I can share. Okay, so I'm gonna it's gonna be a bit jarring because it's two of us, for which I apologize. But building on this question of the transformative character of transnational mobilization, I just want to I want to reach back a bit to the where I ended the portrait of U.S. accumulation chronologically to the post-Soviet period, because this is the period in which we see this kind of new Palestine movement, which is also, or at least in part, became a sort of post-ideological Palestine movement, although that's beginning to change a lot, emerge. And of course, this emerged in the context of the so-called, what was called the defeat of communism. Which was true in the sense that communist states, for the most part, although by no means all of them, had been eliminated. But I just want to return us again to the overall framework within which the U.S.'s obsession since 1917, right, is actually about engineering accumulation on a world scale and stopping alternative or rival poles of capital accumulation from arising, which of course helps us to reinterpret the Cold War as having a particularly a sharp edge because of the nature of the challenge, but allows us a more expansive sense of U.S. imperatives, right? Part and parcel of that is, of course, constantly instilling worldwide defeat. So you, of course, have, confronting the third world, for example, the classic work of Gabriel Coco. Now people are reading. I don't know what people are reading anymore about that, but it was about the violent suppression of all sorts of third world movements, third world radical nationalist movements, communist movements, both in the third world, but also, of course, in the political core. And of course, what went along with that was the violent, although I should have added also the non-violent engineering of political consciousness, that is through the, not just through imposing defeat, but also particularly through the NGO complex, which is, of course, increasingly salient in the Arab-Iranian region, and how it's perceived abroad. So in the region itself, many of the imperatives continued, that is maintaining weapon sales, petrodollar, the safety of the petrodollar, and constant warfare. But in fact, the mechanisms accelerated because the obstacles were more easily targeted in a post-Soviet moment. So because of the Soviet nuclear umbrella was no longer in place, the U.S. could take out Iraq, and it could move to systemic state collapse, which began in 1991 and began to accelerate across the Arab-Iranian region. It could move to these kind of post-Soviet mop-up operations, that is raising remaining strategic challenges. And it could proceed through sanctions, which are a form of economic quarantine and asphyxiation, and what is now called weaponized interdependence, that is used to sever forces economically from the world system. And then their corollary, their complement on the political level, are the terrorists, that is to sever internationalism on a world scale by erecting political quarantines that are enforced with massive jail sentences that prevent political liaison of any kind between activists in not only the US, but increasingly the European core, with all sorts of forces in the region, and not just that region, but also the Philippines and Colombia and elsewhere, who are then activated and labeled as terrorists, right? So Israel becomes both a symbol and practice of the pro-systemic, that is the pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist forces. We see it regionally, for example, that in India post-1992, with the rupture of planning, moved into ever closer alliance with Israel, breaking from its historic anti-colonial stance. That Bolsonaro, one of the first things he did was pay fealty to Israel. Syriza, as it surrendered in Greece, one of the first things it did was pay fealty to Israel. So Israel became a symbol for the pro-systemic forces, but also a practice because it was a spear tip of the U.S. war against the anti-systemic forces in the Arab-Iranian region, right? And so here, of course, we see actually essentially a list of forces. This is the terror lists that were engineered as part of the Oslo process, which is actually a process of pacification of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. All of these forces are basically, the bulk of them, although it was selective, these forces are characterized by opposition to Zionism in Israel, right? And of course, there's many other forces. There's also like the Kahanists from time to time are on it, the Zionists, the extreme Zionists, but they're never sanctioned, right? And from time to time, the sectarian Salafi forces that, of course, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait fund, they're sometimes on these lists too. But this is mere decoration, right? These are actually the fundamental forces, along with the MPA in the Philippines and the FARC, that the U.S. wants to contain, right? So then thereafter, what we see escalating from 1991 onwards, then escalating even more in 2003 and reaching a fever pitch in 2011 is a war on the region, a war on state structures themselves, right? This is not whether you want to call this a war on anti-imperialist states. It's a kind of scarecrow that doesn't allow what is brought into view. What is being attacked are the remaining Arab Iranian Republican states, that is in contrast with the US-aligned monarchies. These are the states that are under threat. In fact, they're under threat as states themselves. And so why is this the case, right? I'm going to get to that. But going back a little bit, the reason we see a different mechanism of targeting, different targets rather than the kind of traditional leftist forces, starting in 1979 and accelerating thereafter is because of the 1979 revolution in Iran, which was, in fact, a revolution. It was populist, it was anti-American, it was developmentalist. It also brought Iran out of the US orbit when it comes to central rent circuits, in particular around oil and weapons. And so in reaction to this, the US began a war on Iran, very apropos and contemporary, given what's going on in the world today as I deliver these words, right? Of course, this revolution in Iran also was not just anti-American, it was emphatically anti-Zionist, right? It then became a buttress for the anti-systemic forces on a regional scale. And these forces, which include the PFLP, Hamas, Qassam brigades, Iran, Syria before its fall, Ansar Allah in Yemen, it's often fixated, are they anti-imperialist? Are they radical left? This is quite not the point, right? The question is they are acting in a logic that is opposed to the system as it currently exists. And so what is the system? The system is nothing other than the actual policy of U.S. imperialism, which is precisely ongoing semi-colonialism and settler colonialism in the region. If the U.S. is trying to sow semi-colonialism, settler colonialism, permanent war, a permanent sense of defeat, these forces then are marked by acting against that logic. That is, they are fighting for the defense of the political sovereignty regime, which was this historic achievement of the nationalist anti-colonial struggles themselves. They are fighting in their way against settler colonialism in Palestine. They are fighting and building on technological sovereignty, which is widely acknowledged that Iran is accelerating technological sovereignty, also through technological exchanges with Russia and China, that is building up a substantial research base. Again, for that matter, North Korea is heavily involved in it. And we are seeing the results of this buildup, and we also better understand the nature of the warfare itself. What is also central is that these forces are overthrowing the sense of defeat, which is actually a necessary political and ideological regulator for the entire US project in the region, but also on a world scale, right? This then brings us, why is the US targeting the state? Well, what is a state, right? There is a caricature often in our movements, the state is pure repression, the state is violence, the state is fascism. This is actually what someone is now circulating. I've just seen it circulating, for example, that Iran is a fascist state. This is a piñata, right? This is a caricature. This is ludicrous. The state is a crystallization of social labor. States own and manage hospitals. States own and manage public transport systems. States own and manage social security and healthcare systems. Even desiccated states, they still have these aspects. States, therefore, not only are mechanisms of social reproduction, that is reproducing people themselves, insofar as a state prevents violence from falling on a people, they protect social reproduction. That is, they are the necessary condition within which people can potentially lead lives free of externally imposed violence. Finally, the state in the Arab region in particular is a potential articulator, a potential way of people coming together as equal citizens in republics, and therefore its destruction is actually a mechanism for accelerating sectarianization. That is de jure in Lebanon, effectively de facto in Iraq, with then sect becoming the central means of political identification. And then you institutionalize sectarianism and you keep the working class divided. Therefore, the attack on the state is a direct interest of the U.S. ruling class. This finally brings us to post-October 7th, where, yes, we have the paradigm of genocide to understand, but what I think is finally important to understand is why has the genocide been prosecuted and persecuted with such ferocity, even in the face of the collapse of the U.S. liberal institutions, so forth, and even the potential collapse of the U.S. human rights regime. I would argue that this is about reimposing the defeat on the Palestinian people, on Ansar Allah, on Hezbollah, the sense of defeat that was challenged from after October 7th. Right, is about reinstilling the sense that there's nothing to be done about regional sanctions, about regional semi-colonialism, about regional settler colonialism, about regional state collapse, that is all of which is channeled through Israel, right? But cannot be reduced to Israel, and therefore defending Israel becomes all the more important. And the U.S. and Israel are willing to impose a genocide on the Palestinian people in order to protect their objectives and the means they use to secure those objectives, namely the ideology of dominance on a world scale. So this is where we are today, and this is also, in a sense, what is being challenged today and yesterday in the military arena. And I believe this helps us interpret what has been going on for the last 2 years, but also the last 2 or 20 decades, and also what will come in the days to come. So thank you very much.
Max, Miriam, thank you so much for joining us, for giving us those important remarks, which I think do a really good job of grounding a lot of what we learned over the course of this chapter of the curriculum in a struggle that is unfolding before our eyes now, and in a struggle that is familiar to everyone watching. So thank you again for joining. In the next lecture series, which starts towards the end of this month, we'll be zooming out a little bit and looking more broadly at imperialism as the primary contradiction, looking at what it is, what its mechanisms are, why there are political forces, including in parts of the left, that continue to deny its significance or its existence, and why it remains essential to understanding the contemporary world, and in particular to developing winning political strategies within it. That begins, I think, in 2 weeks' time on the 28th of June with a lecture on the past and present of imperialism. It'll be at the same time as the lecture today. So Max, Miriam, once again, thank you so much for joining the program, for your remarks today. And we will see everyone in 2 weeks' time in the next lecture.